So a couple general structural comments about how I'm thinking as I'm going along. My idea at this point in general is to focus each day on going through some of the important arguments or points in, we're thinking of Nagarjuna's important texts of reasoning, focusing on emptiness and its relationship to dependent arising, but then also maybe briefly each day saying a little bit about some other text which may be outside that corpus, so we get continue to get a sense of the broader picture of the figure of Nagarjuna. And then, so that's what I'm thinking in a general way. And today, to start with looking at Suhrilika, the friendly letter, just a little bit, hit some of the general characteristic of the text and its some of its points of interest. And then going on today, I want to start by going back to exploring from a different point of view or in a little more depth the excellent question we had yesterday about comparing the relationship of samsara and nirvana to the relationship of a seed and a sprout. And it turns out there's a lot of interesting ways to think about that, which I was just trying to do off the top of my head at the time. But it, the whole 16th chapter of the treatise deals with the question of bondage and liberation from the point of view of emptiness. And then Nagarjuna comes back to it later in the 25th chapter when he's treating nirvana from the point of view of emptiness. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit after we do the friendly letter. And then after we discuss that for a while, then I'm going to go back to where we left off in the middle way, or actually just a little bit before we left off. So right at the end of that chapter, before we get into the 24th chapter, the end of the 18th chapter, last few verses of the 18th chapter, and say some things about that, and then go on from there into the 24th chapter. Okay, so that's my plan in general and my plan for today. You're up to date on the plans as far as I am. So the friendly letter is a text that doesn't exist in Sanskrit, but seems that is always attributed to Nagarjuna. It's written in verse without apparently any auto-commentary by the author. It seems to be about like 123 verses long. It exists in both Tibetan and Chinese translations and was quoted a couple of times by Indian authors in Sanskrit. So therefore you know that it was in Sanskrit and went separately into Tibetan and Chinese, and once or twice a later Madhyamaka writer quoted it so that you know that it really did have a Sanskrit original, but it wasn't very often quoted, maybe only a few times in the Sanskrit literature. So I hadn't spent a lot of time with this text before, and I had looked at it briefly, but I spent some more time with it since yesterday. And just looking at what people say about it and my own impression, it's a text that has nothing very strongly about it that would make you think, oh, Nagarjuna couldn't have written this. I mean, there's nothing in it that sends up some red flag that, oh, they're just saying he wrote this, but I don't really think he did. There's nothing like that. And it is, and that's not just for me. I've seen, other Western scholars, they count it among the books that they consider among Nagarjuna's works because it's traditionally attributed that way, and there's nothing that seems to invalidate or discredit that as a reasonable attribution. On the other hand, and this isn't going against that, but just saying it doesn't focus at all on the topics that you see in the Treatise on the Middle Way, or in the Refutation of Objections, or in the other the text, the 70 stanzas or the 60 stanzas of reasoning, the 70 stanzas on emptiness. It's not about emptiness. And interestingly, it barely touches on the topic, as we'll mention in a minute. It does touch on it, but very briefly. And it also doesn't really talk about bodhisattva aspiration either. In fact, I really can't find anything bodhisattva specific, except as mentioned in a minute. It does talk about the 6 perfections, and the one specifically bodhisattva-ish thing that it says is it makes a reference to Avalokiteshvara specifically, and also then at the end to the Buddha Amitayus. And I was like feeling when I read this that, well, this actually makes me more thinking that maybe it's related to Nagarjuna, because there's all these other traditions that link Nagarjuna to Amitayus. And maybe, we just come from this thing of thinking Pure Land's about devotion and emptiness is not, and it's about reasoning. But I'm starting to think that at some very early time there was some close connection between the devotion to Amitabha and interest in, early Mahayana, including interest in emptiness as a topic in Mahayana. Okay, so if it's not very much about bodhicitta and it's not very much about emptiness, then what is it about? Well, it covers glancingly a whole bunch of different Buddhist topics, including like the Eightfold Noble Path, the 4 immeasurables, that you love and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity. It mentions briefly the 3 jewels. It doesn't go into a long thing about them. It mentions the 4 Noble Truths. It mentions not quite listing, but just giving brief verses on like a huge range of different Buddhist lists and categories. But to my mind, the overriding concern of the text is renunciation. That's what it's really about. And now there are a number of Tibetan commentaries on this work, and Tibetan writers, Rendawa has a commentary, and Nipam has a commentary, and now this book that I'm holding is a relatively new published English translation of a commentary on the text by Kapche Kanguru Rinpoche, who was apparently in the lineage of Nipam, or may have actually studied with Nipam. So it seems to me that this text has an influence on the Tibetan tradition broadly in the area of Lamrim teachings about renunciation, and maybe also on the mind training tradition, as well. But especially on the Lamrim teachings about renunciation, that seems to be the focus. It's addressed, as the title suggests, or we mentioned the other day, as a letter written to a king who was a friend of Nagarjuna. Now, we're not able to clearly conclude whether it was the same king or not, but it seems to have been a king of the same dynasty, so it may very well have been the same king. Perhaps this is a letter that he wrote to the king at an earlier time, when he was still trying to get the king straightened out on some basic things and wasn't ready to go into details about emptiness, and just wanted him to stop running around at night and getting into trouble, which seems to be like some of the subtext, if you read between the lines, it seems to have been like skillfully directed at someone who had a lot of domestic trouble, is that what you say, due to not really having disciplined their behavior very well. That seems to be what I read between the choice of things to talk about and how long they're talked about. Let's put it that way. So I'm just going to pick out some verses that I thought were interesting. On page, let's see, you don't have any pages. Verse 8. Generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, concentration, and the wisdom that knows thusness. These measureless perfections Practice them and cause them to increase so that you become a mighty conqueror who crosses samsara's sea. So it's, even though this is not explored and they don't explain in depth what what it means to be a perfection or anything, it's clear that this list is characteristic of a Mahayana text. Let's see. In order that you see the ultimate, get used to training your mind so that it really understands things or sees things in general properly. That's pretty much what it says. It's not like a really deep, it just says, Murbo Namla, Sulshin, Yila Te. Meditate so as to see things. That's what it says, thing, Murbo Namla. See things in the right way, so as to come towards seeing ultimate reality. So that's all it says about. I'm not skipping over some more detailed explanation of that. It just keeps changing topics. The eight worldly concerns are mentioned in a verse. You who know the world take gain and loss, or bliss and pain, or kind words and abuse, or praise and blame. These 8 worldly concerns. And treat them as the same, not letting them disturb your mind. That's 29. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll keep doing that. Then there's 138 that we may be familiar with. Take food as medicine in the right amount, without attachment, without hatefulness. Don't eat for vanity, for pride, or ego's sake. Eat only for your body's sustenance. So I think we have better translation here, but it's still the same, you can see. I'm just going to read these next 2 verses, 42 and 43, because the second one is one of the only ones that we find cited in Sanskrit by other Buddhist writers in India. Great good and evil deeds are of 5 types, determined by their constancy, their zeal, their lack of a counter-agent, their perfect fields. So strive in this respect always to practice good. A pinch of salt can give a salty taste to a little water, but not to the Ganges. So know likewise that minor misdeeds cannot change strong roots of virtue, I would say. I would translate it. And that last verse is 43. That's 42 and 43. 43 is one that was cited later by somebody in India. 48. Know that humans are in fact not happy, not permanent, no self, and impure. I'm just sort of retranslating it from the Tibetan. Those who pay close attention to that, those who do not pay close attention to it, have it backwards 4 times over and are headed for trouble. I'm trying to make up my own translation because I'm not, very happy with this translator tried to put everything into like poetry, and it comes out very sort of stilted. The next 2 verses, 49 and 50, that was 48. The next 2 verses are 2 of the only ones that really talk a little bit about emptiness in an indirect way. Form is not the self, the Buddha taught, and self does not have form, nor dwell in form. Well, form dwells not in self. So you must see this of the 4 remaining aggregates as, you must see that the 4 remaining aggregates are empty too. So there's empty, and it's an analysis in one verse there. The aggregates are not, the translation says a simple whim, and it's just sort of like at the command of your wishes, or the command of someone's wishes. They don't just come about on a whim. They don't come about from time, or from their own nature, or from themselves, or from God, or without a cause. They come from ignorance and from karmic action and craving. That's 49 and 50. Then there's a lot of stuff about the body and the impurity of the body, and stuff that sort of leading into a lot of detailed discussions about renunciation. My Lord is like reminding us that he's addressing the king. The Buddha taught to close mindfulness of the body as the path we should follow. So hold fast and guard it well. For all of the Dharma is destroyed by loss of mindfulness. That's 54. 58. This is all impermanent and devoid of self. So, if you're not to stay here, refugeless and helpless, drag your mind away, O king, from plantain-like samsara, which has no core. You know, referring to the plantain tree, which doesn't have a pith in the trunk, is the idea. That was, I think I said 58. And then something that this is just kind of example of these things that we know. Harder than for a turtle to chance upon the opening in a yoke in a great ocean is rebirth as a human, following rebirth as an animal. So pay attention to the follow or heed, I guess we'll just say heed the precious Dharma, king, and make your life worthwhile. That was 59. And 60 says, stupider yet than someone who throws slop in a golden vessel covered with jewels is a person who's gotten a precious human rebirth and wastes it, leading a life of evil and misdeed. And then 67 and 68 are things that are constantly reused in texts and that I read in Tibetan. Know that every being has drunk more milk than all the four great oceans could contain. And still, we, following the ordinary way, we continue to cycle, drinking more and more. A heap of all the bones that each of us has left behind would reach to the top of Meru or higher. And to count out the lineage of all of one's mothers with pellets the size of juniper berries, the whole of the earth would not be enough to count that. That's those are 67 and 68. Skip now. There's a long section, the longest section, which I'm going to go through is skip over here, is a very detailed description of all the places that you can be reborn and what the disadvantages thereof are, shall we say. But disadvantages doesn't really cover it. This is pretty vivid stuff here. Yeah, whips, lava, gouging. You get the idea. Okay. So moving, and that is sort of a big part of the middle of the text. 112 is within the treasury of Buddha's words. There's nothing so precious or profound as this, that those who see that things dependently arise, see the Buddha, the perfect knower of the truth. And so you can see these certain points in here, even though they're scattered and not the substance of the text, sort of think, yeah, this could be Nagarjuna, on a day when he has a different topic that he needs to put in the foreground. What need to say more than this? This is the counsel that will truly help. The vital point is to tame your mind. The mind is the root of the Dharma. This is what the Buddha taught. It's hard enough for monks to follow perfectly all these instructions that I've given you. But if you practice well the heart of these teachings, it will give your life meaning. Those are, did I say the numbers? I keep forgetting. That's 117 and 118. And then the last two that I'm going to read are 120 and 121, which are almost at the end. In boundless lives in the worlds of God and men, be a master of the yoga of all excellence, Be like the sublime Chenrezig, and may you work to guide the many feeble souls. So, yeah, the Bodhisattva, may you be, doesn't say the word, but it's telling you and what to do, to be a Bodhisattva. And then that's the only thing that I saw that sort of relates to Bodhisattva, except for the 6 perfections implicitly. And then he says, 121, thus may you take rebirths and dispel all ills, old age, desire, and hatred in a perfect Buddha field. May you have an infinite life as a protector of the world, like Buddha Amitabha, the Supreme Lord of boundless light. And then he comes back with a little bit about giving up your carefree ways and chasing after pretty girls. I had to come back to that theme at the end. I think there was probably a reason. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
You know what's so amazing? So many of those topics are things that are in the early sutras that are in the Mahayana.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Taking it all out. I think that's exactly right.
And then we so often think, oh, look at what Nagarjuna said, not realizing
that Nagarjuna was pulling all of the stuff out of the what we call the Pali Canon, which in those days was, all the sutras they had except the new ones that were Vaipulya, trying to, bring them, come in. Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. Well, that's actually related to a point we're going to talk more about today. That is like, and it sort of fits with this theory about the historical story about Nagarjuna, that he may have been in this betwixt sort of a delicate position politically, and that he applied his genius to the question of he's part of this Mahayana subculture, which is marginalized, and yet he knows how to sort of what the boundaries are and what the points of reference of authority are. He knows how to present things so that it will, it's interesting. This text doesn't use the word bodhisattva, but it brings in ideas that we recognize as Mahayana, right? But it talks about so many things that would be, just as you're pointing out, are like common to it would appear to be, just a kind of regular text that anybody should recopy in their monastery, whether they accepted Mahayana ideas or not. And because of that, some people, there's a few people who question, like the treatise on the middle way doesn't, if you just take it by itself, it doesn't talk about the bodhisattva path. It doesn't quote Mahayana sutras, although maybe it alludes to one and we'll talk about. But mostly it makes allusions and references, just as this text does, to the early, which were they were the canonical texts that all the monks where the Mahayana monks were living would accept and recopy. So you're giving an exhortation that brings in Mahayana ideas, but you're doing it on the basis of allusions and quotations, and that everybody can read and say, oh, this is what the Buddha taught. But then you're kind of Mahayanizing it a little bit as you go along. Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, now we know something about the letter to a friend. Now, just as an introduction to coming back to this question of seed, sprout, samsara, nirvana, I almost said this, but I didn't quite say it. It's like interesting thing is think about that. Just what I've been mulling over lately is this question of, do things change? Of course, we think that things change, and that's really an important thing for us to get a hold of with our mind. We were talking about yesterday a little bit the relationship between impermanence and emptiness, and if we understand how things change, then that would imply that they don't have any fixed nature. But when you say, do things change, if things change, then that would seem to suggest that a thing changes. And if there's a thing that changes, it's sort of like the problem yesterday of what are you going to be when you grow up. It's like, well, if you grow up and you turn into that person who's like a doctor or a Buddha or something, then are you the person who is aspiring at the same time? You're in the same continuum. But so does a thing change? As there has to be like a thing that's there, that's like the thing? Is it the same thing that's changed into something else? And what makes it the same between the time one and time two? So I think when we think about impermanence, even though it has an implication that goes against inherent existence and it provides a stepping stone to it, the normal way that we think about it, things fall apart, things change, also at the same time implies a continued belief that there's some solid thing there that is changing. I find that with me anyway. It's like that, the idea, oh, things change. It's like there must be a real thing there that's changing. It's like sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's like that. What's the it? You know? Lewis Carroll actually, like, I put this in Introduction to Emptiness, those of you who read that, he played with this in Alice in Wonderland. He said that Alice starts to have some strange effects as she goes down the rabbit hole. And so she said, I wonder if I changed in the night. And then she said, if I did change, then I may have become someone else. And if I become someone else, maybe I'm Mabel. Maybe I've become Mabel. Or maybe, I've become Doris or something like this. Who knows who I might be now? If I've changed from Alice, then I could be another person or different from the person before, right? So anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up is because it relates to this question. It's like, can we attain Buddhahood? Like, who would be, like, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like we're aspiring to attain Buddhahood, but it's like, can a sentient being attain Buddhahood? Well, Buddha's not a sentient being. We'll have to stop being us in order to become what we're aspiring that we should become. You know what I'm saying? It's sort of, well, anyway, this is what Nagarjuna is exploring in the 16th chapter, Examination of Bondage. And he often seems to start these chapters with the pithiest verse at the beginning, not always. But I'm just going to go through that chapter and not read all the verses, but just use that to explore this point a little bit more. He says, suppose compounded phenomena cycle in cyclic existence. The compounded phenomena is the phrase used here, but it refers to, he's talking about the aggregates. Suppose that there are aggregates that are cycling through dependent arising in cyclic existence. Are they permanent or impermanent? He says, if they're permanent, then they're not cycling, right? But if they're impermanent, then, that's line 3 of the verse, then if they're impermanent, they do not cycle. Well, that's less obvious to us, but the idea is that if they're impermanent, then you try to look at, like, okay, if there's an impermanent aggregate here, and it's going to, be producing another impermanent aggregate over here, then is it going to be like at the same time as this one, in which case there's no causation, or is it going to lapse and before this one arises? Does it touch it or not? And Tsongkhapa, in his Ocean of Reasoning commentary on this, he says, well, we really can't have them coming together. We can't have them coming together because then there's no such, you can't even talk about cause and effect. So you're going to have them apart, but if you have them apart, then you might as well, when you talk about a seed and a sprout, if you can have a cause that's like lapsed at the time that the effect arises, then you could have a burned seed produce a sprout. It's such a great line that he came up with here. He says, what is it? A roasted seed. We could have a sprout arise from a roasted seed. The thing has already expired when the sprout arises. And he says, now this is what, if this is the case with the aggregates, that the aggregates under analysis, you can't really find how they could be cycling in cyclic existence, then the same thing applies to sentient beings. Whether you talk about it as a person or you talk about the aggregates of a person, you run into the same problem of describing exactly how they could cycle in cyclic existence, how causation could work in effect with cyclic existence. And so, if you can't really talk about how cyclic existence works, then you can't really talk about the process of going beyond cyclic existence either. skipping a few verses, someone raises an objection saying, cyclic existence exists essentially because its opposite, nirvana, exists essentially. And so in verse 4 of chapter 16, Nagarjuna responds, it's not tenable in any way for the compounded aggregates to pass into nirvana, nor is it tenable in any way for a sentient being to pass into nirvana, right? And he goes on to, Tsongkhapa, in commenting on this, says, really what we have to do is use these same arguments that refute the true existence of some achievement by some achievers. And in doing that, we're refuting the true existence of nirvana itself. The true existence of the Dharmakaya must be refuted. This is in page 336 in Ocean of Reasoning, Tsongkhapa's commentary on verse 4 of chapter 16. And then he goes on to quote a number of sutras which are very interesting, and I wonder, reading them, how, like Dolpa Basherat Geltsam, who's saying that there is, like, the ultimate is an ultimately real Buddha, how he would respond, how he would gloss these. The Perfection of Wisdom Sutra says, of course this is not Nagarjuna, this is Jay's commentary on Nagarjuna. He says, Buddha says, worthy Subhuti, nirvana is like an illusion or a dream. He doesn't say samsara is like an illusion or a dream, he says nirvana is like an illusion or a dream. Something greater than nirvana, I would say that it is like an illusion or a dream also. And the Samadhi Raja Sutra says, the ultimate is like a dream, and nirvana similarly is like a dream. The wise take them that way, and this is the supreme discipline of the mind. And there's a further sutra passage that makes the same point. So Nagarjuna, having said that it doesn't really make sense to say that there are beings or aggregates that are the basis of those beings who cycle in cyclic existence, nor does it make sense to talk about some findable or inherently existent beings or aggregates who attain to nirvana. He then says in verse 5 of chapter 16, these aggregates that arise or cease are neither bound nor liberated. And in the same way, the sentient beings that we ascribe or impute to these aggregates are neither bound nor liberated. And then skipping a couple verses, he comes to the point that this is a good thing, that they're neither bound nor liberated, because whoever's bound would not get liberated, and whoever's not bound would not get liberated. If we were either bound or not bound, we wouldn't be. If it were our nature to be bound, we would never be liberated, right? And if we were essentially not bound, there wouldn't be any question of being liberated. We would be already, by way of our nature, not bound. So if someone who were bound if someone who was bound was liberated, then there would be a bondage and liberation occurring simultaneously, like the seed and the sprout, right? And he's saying that because he thinks that's absurd, that you would have someone who's at this point he's saying it's absurd. See, later on, when you're not talking about bondage or liberation, but you're talking about samsara and nirvana, he uses the words differently. But here's, in terms of grasping at things as inherently existent, trying to figure out how they work, you can't really make sense of this idea that bondage and liberation are simultaneous. So, and then in verse 10 of that chapter, when one can bring about neither nirvana nor the elimination of cyclic existence in the way just described, then what are these cyclic existence and the nirvana that we imagine? That's Nagarjuna. And Tsongkhapa comments, ultimately, there is no way to bring about or fabricate nirvana. There is no way to eliminate or extinguish cyclic existence. Neither cyclic existence nor nirvana exists inherently. So it's not possible for any sentient being to detach from or depart from cyclic existence, or even to make any effort to bring about nirvana. That's what Tsongkhapa says. Well, you have to understand, you have to carefully catch the adjectives, the adverbs, right, that he gets in there. The inherently and the ultimately, right? In that case, what do you think nirvana is? Imagining it would make no sense. By imagining here is like conceptualizing it as a, right? It's like His Holiness was explaining mental elaboration there as essentially meaning attributing some inherent quality to the thing. And then Tsongkhapa concludes his commentary on this chapter by saying, by realizing this and by not thinking about it in that way, one will definitely depart from the wilderness of cyclic existence and arrive at the city of Nirvana. Isn't that great? Okay, and then I just thought it was interesting to juxtapose this with, because of how this is discussed, with where several chapters later, Nagarjuna ends up in when he comes to focus on the question of the nature of nirvana. And this is a long chapter 25, but starting at verse 19 in chapter 25, he finally concludes, having examined, nirvana and found it to be unfindable, we could say in the same way. He says, cyclic existence is not the slightest bit different from nirvana. And nirvana is not the slightest bit different from cyclic existence. That's 19. And then 20. Whatever is the limit of nirvana is the limit of cyclic existence. There is not even the slightest difference between them, or even the subtlest thing. And so Tsongkhapa glosses this, saying that whatever is the ultimate limit of nirvana, that means its final way of being empty, that is the ultimate limit of cyclic existence. That is its way of being empty. That these two things, in terms of the way they exist, are indifferentiable. And that's so. Nagarjuna is most of the time, but not always, speaking from what we would call an ultimate point of view when he's carrying out these arguments. And this is this idea when you look at these things from the lens of what's really findable under analysis. You can't say, oh, we got rid of that not so existent samsara thing and got hold of this other thing that's more real. So they're, in terms of the ultimate perspective, they're not the slightest bit different or have the subtlest kinds of quality. So in other words, emptiness is being used to unite samsara and nirvana at this ultimate level, instead of seeing it as like focusing on dualistically, or thinking that this has a certain bad nature that we should recognize and renounce, so as to get over to this one with the essentially good, pure nature, or something like that. And I don't know. To me, this relates to the idea that that I was talking about, in terms of thinking about like what Nagarjuna's situation was and how he was going about what he was doing. That when I teach Buddhism to students, sometimes we do Theravada and early Buddhism for a while, and they learn about no self, independent arising, and nirvana. And then when we start talking about emptiness, then of course it sounds familiar, but somehow different. And I one time had a student, and I don't like have some conceptualization that I impose upon it. I just like teach it, based on the usual books, and let them figure out. Like I never told them this story, that I had tried to tell you haltingly about how this might have worked. And then one time I had a student come up to me and say, "Well, how is emptiness different from no self?" And he said, "It seems to me," before I could answer, "it seems to me that they've combined the idea of no self with the idea of nirvana to get the idea of emptiness." And I was like, I didn't really think about that. but it's sort of like that. You know, if you take the ideas of dependent arising and the way people are thinking and talking about dependent arising, the way they're talking about no self, and the way they're talking about nirvana, and you sort of have them come together, you know, as different ways to talk about the final nature of things, then you get the one taste that we're talking about. It's sort of like that, I think. And it's not like it's some new invention as it is like saying, look, if you really look at all these things that you've already been talking about, that the Buddha, they're already in the word of Buddha, we can see that they're all different ways of getting to the same point. And so beyond just saying that or claiming that, you know, there's some possibility of wondering, you know, like, okay, so if we go for a second to, if you have that one-page handout, it has the very first verse is the opening homage, you know, verse of reverence, veneration at the beginning of the treatise on the middle way. And I unfortunately didn't bring my piece of paper, but I have Jay's translation. In Jay's translation, it goes, I bow to the perfect Buddha, the best of all teachers, who taught that which is dependent origination is without cessation, without arising, without annihilation, without impermanence, without coming, without going, without distinction, without identity, and peaceful, free from fabrication. Now, it's an interesting list of things, and it's an interesting way to start the text. And obviously, this idea of praising Buddha as the best teacher, and that in particular for teaching dependent origination is something that His Holiness has talked about. You know, that among Buddha's perfect body, speech, and mind, that his speech is praised in particular because it's most especially through Buddha's speech that Buddhas benefit other beings. Not that they can't in other ways, but their speech is their particular excellence through which they benefit other beings, and that the best within their speech in terms of benefiting people is the teaching of dependent arising, because it helps with both the method side and the wisdom side. So there's a lot of teaching about that. But one of the things that's interesting here is, that this seems to be, and it's not, it may be I don't know, you know, great authority, but it's possible that this is a place where Nagarjuna is referring to a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. And it may be the only place in the Treatise on the Middle Way where he refers to a Mahayana Sutra, as distinct from many allusions and sometimes explicit reference to other sutras that are not Mahayana. And so it's interesting that he would, you know, if you're doing this like trying to camouflage strategy, why would he start from the very beginning with something that might be a reference to Mahayana Sutra? But first, let me just see, you can think about whether this might be a reference to the sutra. In this version from Walser, he translates the homage as, I pay homage to the fully enlightened one whose true venerable words teach dependent origination to be blissful pacification of all mental proliferation, neither production nor stopping, neither cut off nor eternal, neither single nor manifold, neither coming nor going. Okay, so then the saints, I read it in a different translator so you can see how he translates the parallel passage from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. It's the 25,000 stanza. How does he wisely know conditioned co-production, dependent arising? How does he wisely know dependent arising? He wisely knows it as neither production nor stopping, neither cut off nor eternal, neither single nor manifold, neither coming nor going away, and as the appeasement of all futile discoursing, and as bliss. So it's not quite a quote, but it's very, very similar, and it's praising the Buddha, the teacher of dependent arising, and then identifying dependent arising with this particular series of negations, and then either peace or bliss added in as well. So if Walzer has looked back and say, like, well, what of these things would make sense to somebody who hadn't read a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, didn't know that there were any, right? Which would be most of the people in the monastery, right? And he makes the argument that if you don't look at this Perfection of Wisdom Sutra where dependent arising is identified with all these qualities, and you look at other sutras, you can see that being without cessation or without arising is associated with nirvana. Being without coming and without going is associated with nirvana. But on the other hand, the factors of being without distinction or without identity, or he puts it here, neither single nor manifold, not being one nor many, for example, and not being arising, neither being at the extreme of permanence or the extreme of annihilation. So avoiding the two extremes and not being one or many, those are identified with dependent arising as the middle way, and it has to do with teaching how these conditioned things in cyclic existence work and seeing it accurately. Whereas the other set of qualities, being without arising or cessation and being without coming or going, those are associated with nirvana. And they're shuffled together. I looked at this and it's like, it doesn't go. He puts all the dependent, he has them interlaced like this. And so, as does the sutra, they're mixed together. So the sutra itself, and Nagarjuna in using the sutra, is creating a structure that to somebody who's used to reading about dependent arising in non-Mahayana texts would say, yeah, they're talking about Buddha as the great teacher of dependent arising, and I recognize almost everything they're saying. But then the other things that they're saying are sort of like, oh, those are also things, but they weren't really said about dependent arising, they were said about nirvana. So it's putting in nirvana-like qualities into the praise of Buddha as the teacher of dependent arising. Dependent arising is peaceful. As soon as you say that, praising the Buddha as the teacher of dependent arising, which is peaceful, you're sort of setting it up that samsara and nirvana are going to end up having the same fundamental, same nature at the ultimate level. It's the setup for the 25th chapter where the limit of samsara is nirvana because you're identifying. Yeah. Anyway, I just thought that's something that I don't know how I've been thinking about it and figuring what I've figured out so far about that. I think that was what I wanted to say about that. Yeah. Okay. So let's go on now to look at the middle way, and I want to go back to I want to go back a little bit, as I said, to page 86. I'm just not going to go through what His Holiness says, but just like in light of our discussion that we just had, let's just read this is chapter 18, verses 9 through 11. Not knowable from another, tranquil, not fabricated by mental elaboration, devoid of conceptualization, not differentiated. This is the character of suchness. Whatever comes into being in dependence on another is not identical with that thing. Since it is not different from that thing either, it is not existent, it is it is neither non-existent nor permanent. The Buddhas, saviors of the world, by the Buddhas, saviors of the world, this immortal truth has been taught. Not one, not differentiated, not non-existent, not permanent. Now, if you go back and read these over, leaving out, what His Holiness says about it and focusing on what we've been talking about before instead, it's very interesting that verse 9, these lists of His Holiness only talks about one of the characteristics in his commentary here. But if you look at the other ones, not knowable from an other, tranquil, not fabricated by mental elaboration, and devoid of conceptualization, these are characteristics associated with nirvana. Right? I mean, you have to realize it yourself. Somebody else can't give it to you. It's peaceful. it's the pacification of all dualistic mental conceptions, and it's beyond conceptualization. Right? So 9 talks about these things that are sort of like nirvana, and it says this is the character of suchness, or emptiness. Right? And then it's 10 says anything that comes into being independence in another is not identical with that thing, and is neither different from that thing, either it's neither existent nor impermanent. So he immediately switches from like talking about emptiness and giving like very nirvana-like qualities in 9, and then he talks about dependent arising and giving the specific qualities that we just mentioned of, not being one or many, not avoiding the extremes of reification and annihilation. Those are the dependent arising qualities. So he's got it like, there's suchness in 9, and then there's, which has the nirvana qualities, and then there's dependent arising in 10, and that has the dependent arising qualities. And he's just butting them right up against each other with the implication that these are adding up to the same thing, but not quite saying that, these all are exactly the same thing. And then he says in 11, the Buddhas taught this, not one, not different, not existent, non-existent. So these again are the dependent arising qualities in 11. 4 out of the 8 qualities that are these same, if you take all the qualities in 9 and put them together that are associated with suchness, and you take the qualities in 10 and 11 that are associated with dependent arising, you have all the qualities that are in the opening verse of praise to Buddha for teaching dependent arising. Right? So the whole thing is, he's sort of giving away the game if you read carefully before he finally comes out in 24:18 and tells you that dependent arising is emptiness. He's been getting you ready to find that, to feel that might be plausible all along by weaving the two together. Anyway. And then, let's see, did I say everything I wanted to say about that? Yeah. So then 12, right, we have to talk about this a little bit. So this doesn't, as I just spacily thought at the end of the last time, say anything about or have anything to do with bodhisattvas at all. Right? It's about the 12 on page 88, verse 12. It's about the idea that even this emptiness that he's setting up here, this profound meaning of dependent arising suchness, is the truth that is realized by Buddhas and by hearers. And if people have been given a basis for practice but not been able to attain realization on the basis of that, then in other lifetimes after that, there'll be people who will realize it, yes, alone, without a Buddha to teach them in future lifetimes, but on the basis of this same truth that the Buddha taught. He just said in the previous verse, the Buddhas have taught this immortal truth. So, then people could sometimes realize it even when a Buddha isn't around, because they have heard it in the past from a Buddha and had their minds ripened to be able to have it. And so, of course, Tsongkhapa, following Chandrakirti, will take this discussion to make it just as clear as he possibly can that non-Mahayana practitioners realize the same emptiness. It seems to say that, anyway, to me. But that's not the view, that everybody shares. But in Tsongkhapa's, system and Chandrakirti's system, the idea is that you have arhats are liberated from cyclic existence. They're not getting liberated from cyclic existence. They're not realizing the profound emptiness. They're realizing the same profound emptiness that the Shravakas and the Buddhas realized. Then, if they're realizing the same emptiness that the Buddhas realized, by implication, they're realizing the same emptiness that the Bodhisattvas realized, although they never says the word. Never says the word Bodhisattva. I think the word Bodhisattva, I mean, obviously they had the word because they knew the Buddha had a career in the past as a Bodhisattva. But I think the word is a little bit loaded because of as I'm a little bit speculating, but I think that word, bodhisattva, was a little bit loaded because that was the time when this minority movement, that's what they called themselves. It wasn't just, bodhisattva referred to past lives of Buddha. It was like they referred to these characters who were going around the monastery trying to slip books into the library and weren't looking. Who knows what? I don't want to give anybody any ideas. All right. So anyway, that's how I understand that verse now. And then His Holiness uses this as the occasion, and this is sort of, we didn't get into at the end of last time, to go into introduce us to something, a different perspective, which is that yes, indeed, that you have to realize the same profound emptiness to get free from cyclic existence, no matter what vehicle you're following. But in order to become a fully awakened Buddha, you have to have this, not just a profound object of realization, but a profound type of mind doing the realization in the highest yoga tantra system. And he's saying this is, of course, what he's understanding as the correct final view. It's not being presented in the treatise on the middle way, but His Holiness would clearly understand from his point of view that this was that Nagarjuna himself, would have perhaps advocated that as the author of Aguya Samaja Tantra commentaries. Well, this is on page 89 of the Middle Way in his commentary on 18.12, and he uses this as the occasion to introduce us to highest yoga tantra. It's really talking about how Pratyeka Buddhas could come along, realizing the same emptiness at a time when the Buddhas aren't around, and there are no, and so he's saying, this profound emptiness. It's not just a matter of realizing the profound emptiness to become a Buddha. You have to realize it with a certain kind of mind, according to Tantric. And so he explains this idea that there's a fundamental innate mind of clear light, and that you have to come to use this, cultivate this consciousness, develop this consciousness, and learn how to use that consciousness to realize emptiness, and that this is the antidote for removing the subtle obstructions that prevent to omniscience, or the subtle obstructions that prevent complete enlightenment. And interestingly, he points out that he does one thing he references this to, he doesn't quote Nagarjuna's Guhya Samaja Tantra commentary. Instead, he makes a reference to the Dharmadhatu Stotra, the one of Nagarjuna's hymns, and he says, "I pay homage to the ultimate expanse," or Dharmadhatu. And then he interprets Dharmadhatu, ultimate expanse, Ajimba translates it here, as referring to this subtle kind of innate mind. And so he then makes the interesting point that Jamyang Sheba writes at the end of his great exposition of tenets, which goes through all the non-Buddhist very long book, right? Goes through all the non-Buddhist philosophical schools that he knows about of India, and then all the Buddhist schools in great detail, painstakingly and completely from a sutra point of view. And then at the very end of the text, he says, well, this teaches us the highest way of understanding the supreme object, but the supreme subject that realizes this object is still hidden. And while there are many antidotes described, the highest antidote remains hidden, because the highest antidote is actually a certain kind of wisdom knowing emptiness, the wisdom of this that's associated with this subtle kind of consciousness that's only being taught in highest yoga tantra. So that's not being taught in the great exposition of tenets, and you have to go and look at the tantric literature. His point is that to attain full enlightenment, says His Holiness, it's not enough to cultivate wisdom of emptiness and practice the 6 perfections at the level of ordinary gross consciousness. He seems to be suggesting that the key thing that's differentiated is that if you really want to eradicate the obstructions to omniscience and become a Buddha, you have to have this, in other words, you could get out of cyclic existence, but you couldn't become a Buddha because you couldn't eradicate these very subtle latencies or propensities that are left in the mind from the afflictions having been there, unless you're realizing emptiness with this subtle mind. Then he also goes on to make the point that if you're actually able to do that, then you progress much more quickly on the path if you're able to realize emptiness from this very subtle perspective. And into a little bit about the afflictions as distinct from the imprints left by the afflictions. And seems, to give, in this chapter and the next, to be interested in talking a little bit about this idea that basically what, he's saying in prompt, one of the ideas about this and this chapter is that all different kinds of consciousnesses that we have that are afflicted with various problems, that whether different kinds of illusions and so forth that disturb the mind, are none of them can be posited as any kind of thing, obstruction to omniscience. They all have to do with obstructions to being liberated, and that the only thing that there isn't some thing that a bodhisattva who's like realized non-pure grounds, but a Buddha, there's not some thing that they have yet to realize. They've realized all the subtle objects that could possibly be realized, and they've eradicated all the types of afflictions that could be realized, which include all the different kinds of delusions that one could have about things. There's not some subtle thing that they're still deluded about. But what the problem is that they just have, it's like Bob Thurman called it, a hangover, effect from having been in cyclic existence even though they're completely sober. And that hangover is this sort of countless eon or so, unless you have some tantric, and in fact what he's saying, it doesn't matter. I mean, the sutra system will say that you can get rid of the hangover in a countless eon, but the tantra system will say you'll never get rid of the hangover, and you'll never be able to see conventional phenomena and ultimate phenomena simultaneously and see things in a sense as they really are in a fully purified way, unless you're able to see emptiness from the point of view of this mind of clear light. Okay. So now I want to start the 24th chapter, starting on page 94. Obviously, I think maybe we already made this clear that one of the things I would say about this is a fascinating chapter. Everybody talks about this chapter in particular, 24th chapter. One of the things that's interesting about it is, and I sort of put this in my mind together with Bart and me, the refutation objections, that one of the things that made Nagarjuna great, but one of them was he seemed to be really good at listening to and tuning in to what other people's perspectives were. And I think this is obviously a key to being an effective debater. You can't just be spouting your view. If you're going to connect with other people and be effective in changing their minds, you have to understand where they're coming from, and not just at a superficial. To give a talk about this one time it's over here in this pit, and you think they're in the pit of wrong view, and you're over here. If you're just looking down and saying, oh, you have those bad views down in the pit, then you can't really. You have to be with some part of your mind, go down into the pit and see what it's like from this point of view, or you don't there's no handholds. You know what I'm saying? There's no point. There's that person saying that I'm in a pit, but I don't any way to make any connection between what they're saying. So you have to be able to, if you want to help people like change their mind, be able to make some connection to the way they're seeing things. And I think that this whole speculative idea about Nagarjuna as making a bridge between the Mahayana Sutras and the people that he lived with, that it fits with that he was effective as savior and protector, the Mahayana Dharma, because he understood what the intellectual/political situation is, because he was able to listen to and understand the perspective of the other people around. And this is like very clear in two texts, right here in this chapter, where he he gives you 6 full verses, laying out, the total laying out a perspective in which he is the worst sort of destroyer. The author, Nagarjuna, is the worst sort of destroyer of the Dharma. I mean, he doesn't just say some stupid people say like this. No, he kind of enters into the real spirit of the thing and gives it verses whereby he is perceived as totally having annihilated Buddhism with his teachings, and why that would be so from that person's point of view. And this fits with what he does in the other text, Refutation of Objections, where the whole beginning of the text is a list of objections to everything that he has previously said. And he doesn't actually refute any of them at first. He just lays out this long catalog of charges against himself. And then after doing that for quite a while and not refuting any of them, then he goes back and takes them one by one. But he's listened to what people's complaints are, and it's clear that some people had understood what he was saying well enough to be upset, right? And I think that actually, everybody agrees that Refutation of Objections is by the same person, the same Nagarjuna, the treatise on the middle way. And if you read them and you see the topics and the style, it's very clear that they're not only written by what we call, conventionally speaking, the same person, right? They were written by the same person at about the same time. And I think they were probably he actually essentially wrote this second book as almost like an appendix to, it's like if you put out a book and it gets a lot of bad reviews, and then you publish an appendix, a new edition of your original books with an appendix refuting all the bad reviews of your first one. It's really like that. And one of the and I think it was even thought of like that. It's not thought of down through tradition, but in the way the texts appear, it seems to be like that. Because a couple of reasons. One is that he doesn't have all his other texts, as texts normally do, begin with some reverence to the Buddha. And if you believe it or not, he has, one of the major texts of reasoning doesn't start with any pious words whatsoever. He has no reverence to the Buddha or anything. He just starts up with these objections. And that's because it was supposed to be, I think, an appendix, essentially, to the already existing work. And if you come to the end of the work, end of Refutation of Objections, there is a little bit of a base at the end. And then he says, there's a colophon, little thing at the end saying something about the text, and it says, this was written by the same person. Verse 400, and the count 448. So it's like there's 73 in Refutation. They were just like, let's see what the bad reviews were and take them one by one with regard to the original text. I think it's very clear, and almost the perspective of people who are making these objections is just like the perspective of this hypothetical. Here he's just dreaming up what his opponent will say. This one he actually has their word, he knows exact. Some would appear stronger or more specific, but they don't add up to anything different than this from his point of view. It's all different ways of raising the same problem, which is that you don't see the difference, between thinking of things as existent and thinking of things as, thinking of things as merely conventional existent by way of dependent arising. So you're grasping onto these things as inherently real. This is the basic thing. Do you think that for things to intrinsically exist and for things to exist go together or not? And this is essentially his argument, because you don't understand what it means for something to be a dependent arising, then you think that it must really exist, an dependent arising, because otherwise how could it effectively produce the link in the process of arising? Then when I criticize these things and show how there's no real thing there, then you think that arising and therefore Four Noble Truths, and therefore I've destroyed the Four Jewels. But that's because you made an assumption about what it means for something to exist. And Tsongkhapa, not just only very briefly alluded to by His Holiness on page 94, but in Lamrim Chemo at great length, Tsongkhapa spends a lot of time saying, these people who think that inherent existence and existence have to be together are, we're here, we'll call them the Buddhist realists, right? But J. Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa says, well, they're basically just like these Sufis of Tibet that he's criticizing, that they also assume that inherent existence and existence go together. So they think that all of these refutations and refuting inherent existence have also refuted existence. But instead of, like these Buddhist realists going, oh no, that's terrible, you destroyed the three jewels, the pseudo-madhyamikas of Tibet go, oh, and that's so great. We're all free of existence, and that's what liberation means. Proven that nothing exists, but we'll just pretend that it is out of compassion, right? And right, and that's. Yeah, so he goes on at great length about that, because he thinks that many of the prior interpreters, leaving aside Dolpova Sherab Gyaltsen, who's a different case, but most of the prior interpreters of Madhyamaka in Tibet have fallen to a nihilistic extreme. And he's saying, why do they follow this extreme? Because the same assumption that the Buddhist realists did, which is that inherent existence and existence had to go together. But then they drew from that a much less reasonable conclusion, which is that they were celebrating what from their appeared as the destruction of the three jewels. I think he has more sympathy for the Buddhist realists, obviously, than he does for the Tibetan misinterpreters. Okay, so having laid out these objections, then we come to the very interesting 24.7 on page 96 of the Middle Way. His beginning of his answer. I remember when I first read Sanskrit, I was like, I don't know what this means. Why do they even say these words? You who understand the emptiness itself and the meaning of emptiness and are therefore harmed by it. And my initial reaction the first time I read this was, why does he have to say emptiness? Why did he have to say you fail to understand the meaning of it? Well, it turns out that Nagarjuna knew what he was doing. And and it's very clear that each of these three phrases, the purpose of emptiness, emptiness itself, and the meaning of emptiness, it's not that His Holiness in his commentary here is just making up some stuff. This is like actually explicit in Nagarjuna's text, if you read the whole thing and pay attention. And actually, the passages that he's specifically referring to by these three terms, the purpose of emptiness, emptiness itself, and the meaning of emptiness, are just in the few excerpts that we're reading here in the Middle Way. Somewhat, maybe by coincidence, I don't know. But if you look at page 77, flip back from page 96 to page 77, you'll see that, in fact, Nagarjuna has told us the purpose of what emptiness does. That emptiness, there's this process by which we're trapped in cyclical existence through karma and afflictions, and that to attain liberation, we have to stop the conceptualizations and elaborations of inherent existence that we've added onto things, and this stops through emptiness. And then when His Holiness explained that, he just said, well, does it stop because are they dissolved in emptiness, or is emptiness, the realization of emptiness, the method by which we're destroying something that's, separate from it? But that was his interest at the time. But here, the thing is, my point is that when he says purposes of emptiness, he's referring to a specific verse that he just had stated a few chapters earlier. The purpose of emptiness is liberation, and more specifically, the purpose of emptiness is to teach us something which, through realizing, we will have an antidote to the afflictions and thereby be able to attain liberation. Yeah. And then, so what is His Holiness says about that? His Holiness explains that and talks about more about the afflictions, as I was alluding to earlier, with the different prasanga, the understanding of afflictions. Maybe I should say a little bit about that, but I don't know. Basically, besides what I said before, in Prasangika, there's this idea from Chandrakirti that delusion pervades samsara like the body sense pervades the body. So when you have the other afflictions, when you have an affliction that it's not really separate from delusion. It could be that delusion's part of the cause of another affliction, but but not necessarily. Whether it's part of the immediate cause at that moment of that affliction arising, that it pervades it anyway. That's Chandrakirti's view. So there's an element of delusion even in subtle kinds of afflictions where you haven't clearly, explicitly been at that particular time grasping at the reality of thing, and on that basis, thinking first, for example, we could think, we could think some particularly negative thought about Rush's nature, and then on that basis, form some afflictive emotion, toward Rush Limbaugh. But we might not have had such a, explicit gross delusion thought. We might just have a passing thought of aversion or negative attitude towards them without actually having that conceptualization. But Chandrakirti's point is, even at that time, delusion is pervading all of these afflictions. And it doesn't mean that all the afflictions are delusion, but it means that they're all, a factor of delusion is influencing and operating at the time that all the afflictions are operating. And so this is distinctive in Chandrakirti from the other Madhyamikas, let alone. So anyway, that's just a little distinctive prasangika thing. And so anyway, that's the purpose of emptiness. What's emptiness itself? Emptiness itself refers, we have to look at page 86, where he also told us that, which we read a little while ago. Not knowable from another, tranquil, not fabricated by mental elaboration, devoid of conceptualization, and not differentiated. That is the character of suchness. So he didn't say, as Gelugpa might like, emptiness is the emptiness of inherent existence. So obviously that gives a basis for other people having different ways of talking about, what ultimate reality is besides the Gelugpa way. Koramba says, ultimate is freedom from elaboration. Here it is. Nagarjuna said it, But anyway, His Holiness's way of explaining this I thought was very interesting. At the bottom, starting at the bottom of page 99, you see where he says, having looked at the purpose of emptiness, we now turn to examining its nature. That by examining its nature, that's what he's referring to, that part where the verse says emptiness itself. Fundamental to the misunderstanding of emptiness is nothingness, is a failure to recognize that language and concepts alone cannot adequately encompass emptiness. If we never leave the domain of concepts, then it's natural to think of emptiness as one concept among many concepts. Confined to this sphere, it's easy to go from the correct view that everything is empty to an erroneous view that nothing exists. But the error comes from taking an object's lack of intrinsic existence and making that the ultimate nature of an object in its own right, thinking that things are essentially empty. Because what is their essential nature is that they're empty. So they're essentially empty. They're empty by way of their own nature. Therefore, they're not existent. If the ultimate nature of things is an absence, the reasoning goes, then it must be that nothing exists. But that is an interesting. Of course, that's one of the things that's so interesting about Buddhism is like this idea of positing that the ultimate nature of things is a sheer negation. Yeah. So if the ultimate nature, so emptiness is separate from the object that is empty only on a conceptual level and not in actuality. It's like when we think about emptiness and the table, but then that's why we have the Heart Sutra to keep reminding us, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And the Gelugpa sense is, yes, let's put some clarifications in there of what we really mean. Right? But what His Holiness is trying to do here is saying, yeah, but it's like the point is that these things are always right there together, and they're only divided, by conceptual thought. Emptiness is something emptiness is something, the true nature of which can only be experienced personally and for oneself. That refers, right, to that not knowable from another, the first part of verse 9 on page 86. He's commenting on that line, right? Emptiness is something, the true nature of which can be experienced personally and for oneself, and cannot be fully conveyed to another person by means of concepts and language. Interestingly, that is also said by Nagarjuna implies that when he says not knowable from another in 9. And he comes back to that at the end of his appendix, right before he praises Buddha at the very end. And he has a commentary, auto-commentary on the Refutation of Objections. Nagarjuna does. This is Jan Westerhoff's The Speller of Disputes. It's a translation of what we call Refutation of Objections. It's nice. If we're going to give that book, then I should mention something that someone else already talked to me about, and that is that Jan's a very good scholar. One of the things that's distinct about his translation is that he uses the word substance to translate svabhava, which we translate as, inherent existence or own being or self-existence or intrinsic nature, inherent existence. All of those translations are much more normal and closer to the Sanskrit and the Tibetan. And translating svabhava as substance is not literal, and it's not intended to be literal. It's part of a philosophical understanding that he has, that substance is meaning something that can't be further broken down philosophically or analytically, but has to be found as the irreducible base from which something is made. And so he doesn't mean substance like, the regular common sense meaning of substance. He means a philosophical sense of substance. So if you don't know that, it's very confusing because everybody else uses substance to translate a different word, dravya or zayur, substantial. And Jan uniquely uses substance for svabhava. But other than that, it's like, once you understand that, it's a really helpful book. Because it's such a he's such a good scholar. At the end of this, anyway, in Nagarjuna's own commentary on his refutation to the objections, he says, emptiness is to be understood by each person for each one for oneself. Trying to make it gender neutral, is to be understood by each one for oneself according to this instruction. Only some of this can be taught verbally. That's what he says. So that's the same thing as Holiness is saying here. He didn't cite that, but I thought that was exactly parallel to the point His Holiness is making. When we speak of emptiness, therefore, we do not think of it as some kind of absolute entity that exists there on its own. We're talking about the way that something really or finally exists, but that's in relation to something that we're talking about, like the quality of how you can say the quality of this thing's shape, or the quality of its color, or the quality of how it ultimately exists. And that has these different qualities, and one is its ultimate nature, because it's the one that answers the question, what is it really, right? Instead of the question, could we use it as a hammer, for example, or some other question we could ask. So then it's a mistake, he says, to think of emptiness as an absolute that's independent, could exist in any way apart from the various phenomena that it characterizes. And His Holiness says he thinks that it's this understanding of emptiness that leads the way to mistaking emptiness for nothingness, which I find can't say that I've 100% penetrated, because when I hear this, I keep thinking that he's talking about. Well, maybe this is what it is, that if you reify emptiness as an absolute, then this destroys everything else. They're saying, oh yeah, there's this emptiness, and that's the real nature of it, and therefore nothing else is real, because that's the one reality. Negation. Thinking. Yeah. And then, so that's the second one. I'm running out of time here. Yeah, we're supposed to stop at 11:30 this morning, right? Is that right? Okay, so men, let's finish this verse though. You've understood the purpose of emptiness, empty itself, and the meaning of emptiness. And what is the meaning of emptiness? Well, as it happens, Nagarjuna also tells us that in a verse of the treatise, but he hasn't actually given that verse yet. And that verse, of course, is the famous 24:18, where he says the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. So in 3 specific verses, like 2 of them that are 6 chapters earlier and 1 that's in the same chapter a little bit later, he has the exact specifications of what he means by those 3 phrases. And so then, as to the third one, the meaning of emptiness, His Holiness says, he thinks that the confusion that the other person has, that you're destroying dependent arising because you've misunderstood emptiness, is that's the basis, that's the main problem that's the core of the misunderstanding that leads to the objection. So to correct the meaning of emptiness, he alludes to a passage from the sutra entitled The Questions of the Naga King Anavatapta, in which the Buddha explains, that which has arisen in dependence on others is unborn. Now what's interesting about that, and to me, in this context, is that the unborn, that's referring to nirvana. So he has a sutra that is saying, dependent arising means, in effect, it's saying dependent arising means not arising inherently, but the way it's dependent arising is the unborn. So it's linking dependent arising to nirvana, in the sutra. He's stating that things and events cannot possibly possess intrinsic origination because they originate in dependence on other factors. And in this sense, they're unborn. They don't arise by some power in themselves. And this is his point, is that emptiness must be understood in dependent origination. Okay. And then His Holiness still has more commentary on this, and this leads him to talk more about what we mean by dependent origination in this system. And this section starts on 101, goes over onto 102, and this kind of stuff bears rereading. I've read this book more than once. It's like a lot of things. The Lehigh teachings, for example, like when you first hear them, you're like, that guy's smart. I don't know what he's saying, And then you go back and you're like, oh, he's doing something here, And then eventually you start to see what the method is, what he's doing. And I think actually this writings have that. Sometimes you're like, well, why does he say that then? And then later you figure that there is some reason. Anyway, so having explained this question of the meaning of dependent origination, he wants to and go in to explain that, dependent arising has these different levels of meaning. The first level of meaning is that, this idea, if things existed intrinsically, then causes and effects would be isolated from each other by each one existing in and of itself, and there couldn't be any dependent arising. So, dependent arising in terms of cause and effect. But he goes on to say that beyond that, there's this idea, beyond the idea of causal dependence, dependent arising implies that things are imputedly existent, that is, that they're ascribed to or labeled on top of a basis of designation. Then for a dependent relationship between the name that we ascribe and the basis to which it's ascribed. And this, like the first one, is a common understanding in early Buddhism as well. Not all schools had the same way of explaining it, and some, they didn't always. One of the big discussions in early Buddhism was which things exist substantially and which things exist as imputations. And they didn't agree about which things were in which categories, and that was something they talked about a lot, was what's the basis of imputation, what's the thing that's imputed. And a lot of times the subtext behind, but not always, the text behind this discussion was what the real things are that are substantial, because things that are basically cash out as non-existent. They're just like what we talk about, but they aren't real. But the real things are on the basis of designation, right? So that was the way people thought about this, and so he's saying there's this idea then that one way to think about dependent arising is the relationship between the object that's imputed imputation. And I thought that would probably be maybe that would be subtle enough for His Holiness to say here, but it wasn't. On the page 102, he says, however, Nagarjuna takes it to an even deeper level of subtlety. Not only are phenomena dependent on their component parts, and I think if you think about what he means there in relationship to what he just said, he doesn't mean just like wholes and parts. What he means is that phenomena are dependently designated in relationship to component parts. In addition to that, the problem is that if we look down among the parts, we never find anything we can point to and to say, here is the real thing, the defining characteristic. This is the idea, is that it's not just that things are imputed in relationship to the basis of imputation, and that would entail parts, or extends in time, that would entail parts. But it's also that we can't find anything to point at within the basis of designation that is the object or has the distinctive character of the object. And as Holiness put it in a different way, different time, is that there isn't any. Well, maybe he does here too. That there's no objective basis. There's a basis of designation that's suitable, but there isn't any objective basis. That is, like, there's nothing that exists from the object side, in and or among the basis that makes it suited to be designated as. And of course, that's where. And now you're on Prasangika territory. You're in the spooky ground of like, what are... That's what he means here when he's going to this 3 levels. He's going, cause and effect, then he's going to things exist as imputations. Then not only do they exist as imputation, but there's nothing in the basis that you're imputing to that you can point out and say that's what makes it that. Because for it to be that depends always on including the perspective of the designator. It's always that for a point of view. That's why I think he uses that word objective base, he's talking about. Then he makes the distinction here on page 102 between a Svatantrika way of doing it and a Prasangika way. He doesn't use the word Svatantrika, but that's his point, is that there's some people who agree that, with the idea that nothing can be found under analysis, but they still think that phenomena have some thing by virtue of which they're naturally appropriate to be designated. And when you go, you don't find it. But conventionally, they have to have some objective basis. And that would be that's what he's positing as the Tantric view. It's like, if you get into this more, I mean, it's worthwhile to understand the Gelugpa system well, and that's exactly what, and they say it over and over. But then, of course, the thing that's interesting is to look and say, which Svatantrika said that when and where. And it becomes like very hard to, and you see like that this is cases active work, just like why Nagarjuna wrote in this way rather than some other way. And Tsongkhapa had to do a lot of detective work to figure out that there was some philosophical difference, which now we're just positing as though it were self-evident. But it's not self-evident in the evidence. It's like it's an argument that's being made to interpret text, which by any interpretation from that by many other smart people, both before and since. But not to say, but arguments where everyone will look at it and say, maybe it's a divided jury. It's not. It's like, well, that's a good argument, but it's not clear to everyone that it's 100% airtight. That there were really people who had this view that they were claiming as a Svatantrika view. But he's alluding to that again, and I'll stop now. On page 103, where he says, it's not, it took me a while to figure out what he's saying here. It says, in the middle of that page 103, he says, it's not merely that things cannot be found when sought critically. Things exist in terms of dependent designation. And this existence on the basis of dependent designation can only be posited within a relative framework, with no independent status. Now, first when I read that, I thought, well, why does he say it like that? Because it's not merely that things cannot be found when sought critically, and things exist in terms of dependent designation. I would think initially reading it, you would say, things can't be found when they sought critically. That's the emptiness side, but they exist in terms of dependent designation. That's the conventionally existent side. Meaning at all. It's not. I mean, it's true, but it's not what he's saying. It's not. What he's saying is that when you search for things and you can't find them under ultimate analysis, that's so all Svatantrikas accept that too. We have that in common with all Madhyamikas agree. That's what the whole book's about. Nagarjuna's book's about. You search for things, you can't find them. But he's saying that isn't the complete story. It's not just that when you search for them, you can't find them, and that they exist in only terms of dependently designated. It's that even this existence on the basis of a designation can only be posited in a relative framework without any objective basis. For Sangaka move at the end of that paragraph in the middle of what he's doing is repeating without still using the words. We all agree nothing can be found ultimately, yeah. But some people are still insisting that each thing have its conventionally existent intrinsic nature, right? And Prasangikas are saying that doesn't make any sense. Okay. I went a few minutes over. No time for questions. When we resume, when we come back, I'll answer questions later this afternoon. We start tomorrow, we'll pick up from that point in the middle way, and then if we get through that chapter, we'll go on to look at the Precious Garland handout maybe next. Okay.